Hey everybody, welcome back to A&P2. So we are going to do a quick lecture on blood vessels and circulation. So my plan is to kind of front load this thing. I want to hit you with the main bits first, and then we're going to go through and add some minute details as we progress. So let's get rolling and see where this thing takes us. All right, so what is the cardiovascular system? You've seen this slide before. The idea is that this is going to include the heart and the blood vessels. We're going to be bringing nutrients and oxygen to our cells while also picking up waste and carbon dioxide and offloading those. The plan is here to bring blood to the lungs and the kidneys and the intestines and the liver. The main concept is to bring oxygen in to the lungs, get blood to that oxygen so you can cycle it around the body, and then pick up carbon dioxide as a byproduct, go to the intestines, get nutrients, carry that to the body cells, and cycle that around to be used by the body cells for general maintenance or fixing damage or what have you, and then pick up metabolic wastes. Those metabolic wastes go back into the bloodstream to be taken to the kidneys to be purified, to the liver to be purified, and the system continues. So the concept of this cardiovascular system is to keep fluids cycling around the body to be constantly refreshed and to pick up waste products and to deal with those as time progresses. And again, blood flows through this system very quickly. Your whole blood volume is going to cycle in about a minute, sometimes much faster. And I'm sure I mentioned this before, but your blood is always in your vessels. So you have a closed circulatory system. So your blood's always in blood vessels as opposed to some other organisms where blood is sort of pumped into big cavities and covers the body internally. It's a neat thing. All right, so the functions of the cardiovascular system will be to generate blood pressure, moving blood from place to place, transporting that blood around, exchanging nutrients and waste as we have described at the level of the capillaries. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a few minutes. The capillaries, folks. Your capillaries are the smallest blood vessels you have. Your red blood cells line up single file to travel through them. And these are the critical exchange areas of your body. So when we say that we send blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen, what we're really doing is sending blood to the capillaries in the lungs to pick up oxygen. When we say that we send the blood to the kidneys to have nitrogenous waste removed, what we're really saying is we're sending blood to capillaries in the kidneys to remove nitrogenous waste. Capillaries are where the exchange takes place. And of course, we're going to be regulating blood flow and sort of where it goes to put blood where it needs to be. We do this using the cardiovascular system by vasoconstricting certain vessels to limit flow through them, and vasodilating other vessels to increase flow through them. So this concept of vasodilation, vasoconstriction, this determines where blood goes in your body. You have way more blood vessels in terms of area than you have blood to fill them. So a lot of it's shut down at a given period of time, and the way we shut it down is by limiting blood flow to it using vasodilation, vasoconstriction. All right, good. Let's go here. So let's talk blood vessels. So your heart pumps blood out into arteries. Okay, arteries are afferent; they carry blood away from the heart. Those arteries come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but eventually that will lead to smaller arteries we call arterioles. These are small arteries. And the arterioles are really important because they're the real pressure regulators of the body. When we talk about vasoconstriction and vasodilation, we're mainly talking about the arterioles. The arterioles have the ability to really shut off blood flow to capillaries or to open up and really let flow through to the capillaries. So the arterioles are very important in this. All right, artery going down to an arteriole. The arterioles are very important at limiting blood flow. They have these precapillary sphincters that can really close off the flow. Then from arterioles, again, regulating blood pressure down to the capillaries. We've already sort of talked about these a little bit. So the capillaries are very small. Blood flows through those single file. So the blood cells go through single file, and they are the exchange area. Okay, the exchange area. And they are made of a single layer of epithelial cells, which we'll be seeing here in a second. They form beds, so these big capillary beds that basically branch all through tissues to provide oxygen, to provide nutrients, to pick up wastes, what have you, carbon dioxide, to allow those tissues to function. So your bicep, okay? The reason your bicep is capable of flexing and doing the things that it does is because the muscle cells there are just covered in capillary beds. Okay, they got blood flow in spades. There's lots of blood flow coming through them, and it's all from these capillary beds. The capillaries are very small to increase their surface area internally to allow them to better exchange nutrients. Very important. All right, from the capillaries, we run into a venule. Venules are just small veins. They pick up blood from capillary beds, not a terribly fancy thing. And then from the venules, we run into full-on veins. And the veins are super neat from my perspective. The veins have really crazy variation in diameter compared to arteries. So an artery tends to be very small in diameter. The lumen, the opening, the lumen in an artery tends to be quite small, and it will have a very thick, really, really muscular wall, so that when blood is pumped out of the heart under high pressure, these arteries have to really take the pressure. Okay, they got to hold it. Whereas the veins, blood's already gone through the arterioles, which suck out a lot of the pressure, gone through the capillaries, so all the pressure is gone. So when you enter the the venules and the veins are at low pressure. So what happens is the veins tend to be very large in diameter with really skinny walls. Let me say that again. Arteries, small lumen, veins, big honking lumen. Arteries, thick, strong, muscular wall. Veins, really thin, weaker wall by comparison. The veins basically store blood on its way back to the heart. Okay, at any given moment, your veins contain about 70% of your blood flow, and because they are a low pressure system, sometimes it can be difficult to get blood back to the heart. And so what you'll find is your lower extremities, and especially your lower extremities, tend to have veins. I'm sorry, what am I talking about? Valves in their veins, venous valves. Valves in their veins that will capture blood and prevent backflow. So when you're walking around doing the things that you do, you got blood kind of trying to come back up to your heart from your legs and your lower torso. The veins there have to have valves to keep blood from flowing back down with the force of gravity. If you've ever seen somebody has varicose veins in their legs, for instance, these big honking veins, that's when the valves no longer function correctly, so blood tends to pool down there in those thick veins. We have to wear, like for instance, fancy socks that sort of compress the area and prevent buildup of blood. It's kind of a neat concept. That's how it works. All right, yeah, that's a great walkthrough of how this all goes. Now check this out. You can really see it. Now, it's hard to make out in reality here, but what we have is a big honking artery. That artery is going to come out to these minor arterioles, and then in this you have these crazy capillary beds. It's sort of hard to make out the veins in this particular system because it's all stained red, but that's how this works. Artery, arterial, capillary bed. That's sort of the way this all goes. It's a neat thing. Yeah, that'll do. All right, let's go here. Let's talk about the structure. Now we have established that arteries have really thick, strong walls, whereas veins are very thin by comparison, and veins have valves. You don't find valves in arteries, you find them in veins. Man, I'm gonna mess this up the whole time. It's a very simple reason. Arteries have really high pressure, forcing blood where it needs to go. I mean, it's being pushed out from the heart, whereas the veins, again, have to capture the blood to get it back up to the heart eventually, through means we'll talk about in a second. So the valves are very important here. Now, 3 layers worthy of our consideration. These are the tunica intima, or tunica interna, tunica media, and the tunica adventitia, or the tunica externa. Depends on how fancy you want to be. It's kind of like in your bones you have Haversian canals, which are nowadays called central canals. Okay, they're Haversian canals, but we call them central canals to make it simple. This is the tunica adventitia, but to make things simplistic, they've kind of augmented this to say tunica externa. Because where is it? It's on the outside. All right, this is the tunica interna. Okay, because it's on the inside, but it's tunica intima. You'll hear other folks call it one or the other. Okay, so I'm giving you both so we're on the same page. All right, here we go. So the tunica intima, all right, tunica interna, this inside portion here is very important because it contains endothelium. This is the same endothelium that's kind of continuous with the inner lining of the heart itself, and it's ultra slick. Okay, the inside of these blood vessels, this endothelial layer, this tunica intima, is ultra slick. And the reason it's there is to decrease the amount of friction as blood flows through the body. So you got this slick lining, especially of like your aorta. Man, I wish, I should totally force you guys to buy hearts to dissect. you would understand. Like it's just a whole different feeling. Like the inside lining of the heart, the big aorta coming up off the heart, like the lining of them, the way it feels, it's just this ultra glassy, smooth surface. And it's there to limit friction. That's the whole idea, is to limit friction. All right, the tunica media is important because it contains smooth muscle. This is going to be very important for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Your arteries play a role in this, just like your arterioles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your arteries have the capacity to squeeze off flow or to open up and allow flow. Again, vasoconstriction, make the tube smaller and limit blood flow. Vasodilation, open the tube up, increase blood flow. Your arteries play a role in this. Your arteries have a thick tunica media, and that thick tunica media is made of muscle, okay, smooth muscle. It's going to contract slowly, but have very little fatigue, all right? And then last but not least, we have the tunica externa, which is basically fibrous connective tissue, a bunch of collagen fiber, okay, a lot of collagen fiber, kind of holds things together, prevents things from blowing out. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I think that'll do, folks. So thick lining on the outside to prevent them from blowing out, a bunch of collagen fiber, muscle in the middle, and then a smooth lining on the inside. And again, look at the difference, okay? Look at the difference between the artery and a vein. The veins have a really huge lumen, big honking lumen, whereas the arteries have a very small lumen, but way more muscle. It's very simple as to why. The muscle in there has to take the pressure of the heart beating, that systolic punch, man. You got to think about it. It's really laid into it. It's like a hammer, if you keep up with hydrodynamics. It's really rushing in there, and those arteries have to take that pressure, so they have that really thick muscular wall to do so. Whereas the veins are just getting blood as it drains out of the capillary beds, and it's at low pressure, so the veins don't have to deal with any kind of issues along those lines. Their main issue is trying to get blood back to the heart because gravity wants to hold it down, so they have the valves to do that. Okay. Structures of arteries and capillaries. So this is a worthy consideration. I've sort of undersold this whole concept as we've been progressing. There's more than one type of artery. Okay, there's a lot happening there in reality. So let's go through and talk about that now. There are such a cool concept, dudes. There's elastic arteries, muscular arteries, and then we have our arterioles and our capillaries. So let's go through and talk about them. Your elastic arteries. These are neat. These are the closest ones to the heart. Mainly we think about the aorta, like the big bits right on the heart. The first, like the highest pressure portions of the arterial network where blood comes out right of the heart, and it's really taking all the pressure, man. Those are going to be elastic arteries. And they're very thick walled. They have a bunch of elastic fiber, high elastic content. Let's see, allows expansion, reaction, constant flow. All right, let me describe to you what's actually happening here. It's such a neat concept. As the heart beats, you don't want blood pulsing through the cardiovascular network. It's totally a weird thing. Like you can feel your wrist. You can make out your pulse, right? You can make your pulse out. But what's really happening is the blood is constantly flowing. It's not like your blood goes as it's moving through your body. Your blood is constantly flowing. So if you get a cut and it bleeds well, it's not like you see it go squirt, squirt, squirt out of there. No, it's going to be a constant flow out, okay, before it clots, hopefully. The reason you get the constant flow is because the elastic nature of these big honking arteries like the aorta, okay, the elastic arteries of the body. Man, this is the dumbest way to describe this, but it's all I can think of. It's like bagpipes, okay? If you go pause this video and you go watch somebody play bagpipes, they're blowing into this bag, and then they take another breath and they blow into the bag, but it's not like there's a pulsing of sound. What they've done is they've filled the bag up with air, and they're squeezing it with their arm to keep a constant flow of air coming out of the pipes themselves. Your elastic arteries, the heart will beat systole, right? And the artery will go poof and be full of blood, but it's elastic. So during diastole, the elasticity, ooh, that's a lot of words. Let's do that again. During systolic pressure, the artery will balloon. And then during diastolic pressure, as the ventricles are relaxing, preparing to do the thing again, The elasticity pulls the artery back to its resting state, and by doing that, it pumps blood down the line. So you get poof, 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 poof. So what's happening in reality is blood is constantly a steady flow through, because you get the ballooning in the pressure from the heart, and then you have the artery slowly go back to a resting state, forcing blood on down the line. This gives us constant flow. Your blood doesn't come in spurts. That's not the way this works. It's a constant flow because of the nature of the aorta being elastic. And that's amazing from my perspective. Next down the line here, we got muscular arteries. Muscular arteries here. These are going to be the main arteries that deliver blood to your organs and things, like your arteries in your arms, your arteries in your legs, the big ones down there. Those are going to be muscular arteries. They will certainly play a role in vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Like I put the femoral artery on here as an example. It's a good example of a good muscular artery. Certainly involved again in where blood goes, vasoconstriction, vasodilation. We have our arterioles, very important for determining where blood goes. It's going to be taking blood to our capillary beds, and again, our capillaries made up of beds, which I'll be showing you here in a second, and they are the site of exchange. They are very small. They have really high surface area. Blood cells have to pass through single file. Great at exchange. Capillaries. And worthy of mention here is the parasites. And it's said just like that, parasites. Like normally you think of parasites, you're thinking about stuff in your body that's not supposed to be there. These are cells, parasites. And what they do is they're sort of helpers for the capillaries. There are a whole variety of different types of these, but they generally speaking will stabilize capillary walls, control permeability, and they will be playing a role in what's called your blood-brain barrier, and I'll show you why in just a second. All right, here we go. So there are three types of capillaries: continuous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and sinusoidal capillaries. Now, what the heck do these do? So continuous capillaries are continuous because they have very few gaps in between them. All the cells here are going to have tight junctions in between the gaps, so there will be very few openings, referred to as intercellular clefts. All right, intercellular clefts are the small gaps between tight junctions in the endothelial layers of these capillaries. All right, so what we have is a pretty much continuous wall in a continuous capillary. These are not very leaky capillaries. Here, for materials to get from the capillary into the body, like into body tissues, it pretty much has to travel through the cells of the endothelium. So we get what are called these penocytic vesicles. You can sort of see these here, right? These vesicles are basically from endocytosis leading to exocytosis, carrying things in and out of the cells. Okay, into the cell and then out the other side, moving things where they need to go. Continuous capillaries are the type that you find in the brain for the blood-brain barrier. So parasites sort of make them have tight junctions that don't allow any movement. Okay, very little to no movement between cells. Again, this is part of that blood-brain barrier that we talked about in the past, if you took me in Anatomy 1. There are fenestrated capillaries, and fenestrated capillaries have pores. Okay, there are certainly gaps in between cells here, and then there are pores in the cells themselves. They are fenestrations, if you will, small openings. And what these will do is allow for sort of a movement of fluid at a higher rate through this tissue. Now, they certainly do have an outer covering, but by having these holes here, materials move through pretty quick. The kidneys are famous for having fenestrated capillary networks. In your kidneys, you got a lot of blood flow through, and what you want to do is you want to cleanse the blood. So how do you do this? You pretty much remove all of the blood plasma and filter it, and then stick it back into the blood supply. How do you get the blood plasma out quickly? Well, you have fenestrated capillary beds, or capillary networks, I should say, inside of the kidneys, and it allows for a lot of fluid to leave very quick. Again, in a fenestrated capillary, you get a lot of pores in those blood vessels, and it allows a lot of fluid out. Yeah, that'll do. And then, of course, there are sinusoidal capillaries, and man, sinusoidal capillaries are really open. Okay, really, really open. They allow a lot of free movement of materials in and out of the capillary, and these are very famously found in bone marrow. okay? So in your bone marrow where you got a lot of blood cells moving in and out, or I should say making their way into the bloodstream, you want to be able to get those things out easily, or get them into the bloodstream easily, I should say. So you have these big openings to allow stuff to get into blood flow. Again, in the bone marrow, these are kind of famous for that. Yeah. Oh, I guess I could mention Kupffer cells. So oftentimes here, we have these Kupffer cells and they're macrophages. They're kind of neat. Do I have one on here? No, this is parasites. So the Kupffer cells sort of reach down into these sinusoidal capillaries, and they have feelers that feel for certain major histocompatibility complex proteins. The long story short is they're looking for stuff that's not supposed to be there. Actual parasites or any pathogen is what I'm trying to get at. And the Kupffer cells sort of deal with them when they find them. Now, blood flow through a continuous capillary is fast. Blood flow through a fenestrated capillary is slower, but still quick. Blood flow through a sinusoidal capillary is slow, man. Because it's got all of these undulations and open spots and what have you, the blood's really got a lot of resistance and friction. So blood flow through them is quite slow, All right, capillary beds themselves. So what you find here is you've got an artery moving through this vascular shunt. Do I have a vascular shunt? Yes, I do on here. And then into a venule and a vein. So we've got an artery, arterial, venule, vein. And if the arterioles want to, they can crack open flow into these capillary beds. So the capillary bed then, where the blood cells move single file, are going to allow for exchange of nutrients and oxygen, what have you, into whatever tissue they're around. So again, think about a bicep, think about anything in the body for that matter. They're all going to have capillary beds and allow for the movement of fluids. So when the precapillary sphincters are open, they're going to allow a lot of flow into these capillary beds, but otherwise they're going to close these off. And again, the idea is there is not enough blood flow in the body to fill all those capillaries at once. You just can't do it. So do I have a number? Yeah, 3/4 of the body's capillaries are shut down at any given period of time. And they sort of, we'll talk about this later, but they have an ability to decide when to open and close internally. When the tissue there becomes in a low oxygen condition, they'll open their capillaries up and allow for more oxygen to come in via the blood. And then when they have adequate oxygen, they can close it all back off and send the blood somewhere else to do the job. It's a really amazing system. Again, vasoconstriction and vasodilation play the role here to allow these capillary beds to function correctly. When you are dilating blood vessels, you're increasing flow. When you're constricting blood vessels, you're decreasing flow. And that's how this works. Let's see, do I want to say anything else about this? I'm going to briefly mention your lymphatic system just because it's sort of fascinating. Your capillaries, again, let's think back to how this works. A lot of these are going to be fenestrated. You have some sinusoidal capillaries. Even these continuous capillaries have intercellular clefts, which are little gaps that allow the movement of fluid in and out. Every time your heart beats, you got to imagine, man, this is such a neat concept. Every time your heart beats, you got to imagine that this capillary bed is going to go poof and balloon, man. It's going to balloon out with pressure. You got all this pressure just slamming into that capillary bed, and it's going to balloon out. And when it balloons out, there's going to be gaps in between the cells and fluid, not blood cells. Blood cells do not leave the capillaries. Again, you got a closed system. But fluid flows out, and it flows out of these capillaries. And then the moment pressure comes off and you go to diastole, so when the pressure decreases, you can imagine most of that fluid goes back into the capillary bed. And that's good. It works like a charm, but there is a little bit of fluid left behind. We'll talk about percentages and numbers as we get into the lymphatic system, but a little fluid gets left behind. Every time your heart beats, a little bit of fluid is left behind. And what your lymphatic system does is it's got lymphatic capillaries that pick up the excess fluid that's now called lymph and sends that back to your cardiovascular network, which is a really good time to test it for any kind of pathogens that might be present as well. So it works like a charm. Yeah, all right, that's good. Oh, look at this gorgeous image. Oh my gosh. So these are pictures I took. This was at the Body Worlds exhibit in Charlotte, North Carolina. So what you see here, these are real human parts. For instance, a head, a brain, a head with a brain there, you've got a heart, here's an arm, and what's happened is they've gone into the arterial network and injected it with a plastic dye stain that turns into elastic, basically. It's called an elastomer. Okay, so they inject it with elastomer. It's a fluid, so it runs all through the system, even into the capillary beds. And again, you can make out nice, clean capillary beds on this heart and this arm. Look at the muscle, right? The muscle's just packed with capillary beds. Look at that arm. That's all blood vessels. There's no muscle there. It's all been digested away. But anyway, so we fill these blood vessels up with this elastomer, and then once it's hardened, you can go in and chemically treat the area and remove all the physical tissues. Okay, so you pull all the actual tissues out, leave behind just the elastomer, and you end up with these gorgeous views of how blood vessels flow through a head, how blood vessels flow through a heart. Like, look at these cardiac veins, right? Or arteries, I should say. We get a gorgeous view of musculature and the capillary beds they're in. It's really a neat thing. So take a look, man. It's super cool. Like, you can really see where these cardiac veins, or arteries, I should say, are running down, and how the muscle in the heart is vascularized. It's a really neat process. So yeah, worth your time. Just check out the pictures. And if you ever get a chance to go see one of these bodies exhibits, you better jump on that. It's a wonderful thing. You learn so much. The venous system. So venules, again, are the small veins, and venules still give a lot of flow through. They still have a lot of open areas. They're highly porous. They let a lot of white blood cells and stuff kind of move through the walls if necessary. They are still quite small by comparison. Yeah, that's really good enough. I mean, this is not terribly complicated. They're small veins. Then the veins themselves still have the three basic walls that you'd find in an artery, but not very muscular. Big lumens, as we described previously, and also the presence of venous valves. Okay, very important that these have valves. And again, worthy of mention here is that most of your blood is found in the venous system at any given period of time. So it's going to be mostly found in your veins at any given period, mostly in the lower body. Because again, think about gravity. So gravity is pulling down on this blood, and your heart's and other things that we're going to talk about later have to work to get that blood back up into your heart and thus into the arterial networks. Yeah, that'll do. The veins are considered capacitance vessels because they are a blood reservoir. Okay, they hold a lot of blood internally. Yeah, that'll do. Monitoring circulatory efficiency. So we have a variety of ways that we can measure the function of our cardiovascular network using our arterioles, or I should say using our arteries and veins. So general vital signs: pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, body temperature. If you want to see how well somebody's doing, you're checking these concepts. Okay, your vital signs. When somebody says vital signs, we're talking about pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and body temp. Okay, if any of these get out of whack, we got problems. Pulse you can find all over the place. These are good areas. Basically anywhere you can palpate and get a feel of the expansion and relaxation, if you will, of the arterial network. Again, remember, these things have a ballooning a little bit here and there. Pulse rate, well, I guess we'll get to that here in a little while, but it's highly variable. Normally about 70. Okay, you get about 70 beats per minute, but it can go way on up if it has to, especially during really strenuous activities. Let's see, normally we use radial pulse, that's true, so we're going to be checking that on the arm. You saw me do it mere moments ago. Again, I like to use the neck as well, so a nice carotid artery pulse pressure. So these pressure points, if you will, are where these are close to the surface of the body and we can get at them easy. Okay, so it's simple, works like a charm. All right, circulation, basic concepts, blood flow. Now, blood flow is a volume of blood flowing through the vessels, or through a vessel, an organ, or a circulation area for a given period of time, or even the whole vascular system. That would be cardiac output. So blood flow. Now, what I want you to realize about this is blood flow, the amount of fluid that can run through the system, is determined by basically two things. That's resistance and pressure. Okay, pressure as generated by the heart, or resistance. Think about like vasoconstriction and vasodilation would be a good way to think about resistance. So if you vasoconstrict a vessel, that's going to have really high resistance, and that's going to limit flow. Whereas if you dilate a blood vessel, it really opens up, and that allows for more blood flow because there's less resistance. So resistance is the opposition to flow, it's friction within the blood vessels. oftentimes based off of vasodilation, vasoconstriction, and then blood pressure, force per unit area. This is going to be generated by the heart, okay? Yeah, that'll do. So what you end up with is this formula. Now, never in the world would I make you compute something like this on a test, but I'm just using the formula as an example of how this works, all right? So blood flow is determined by the pressure gradient, the variations in pressure. So imagine blood flowing down your descending abdominal aorta. So the aorta comes up out of the heart and then shoots down. There's much lower pressure low or down, and it's getting help from gravity. So blood really flows down the descending abdominal aorta, whereas when it's having to work to go up, it's a little tougher. Okay, so pressure gradient, blood flow is determined by a pressure gradient and resistance. So the amount of pressure and the gradient in that pressure and how much resistance is there. Pretty straightforward. The basic concept here is the greater the pressure difference between 2 points, the more flow you get. The higher the resistance, the less flow you get. Again, think about the blood pumping and vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Yeah. Heart pumping generates flow. And that's absolutely what we want here. So that works just fine. Now, systemic blood pressure. So this is going to be kind of determined by two main things in terms of our arteries and the amount of pressure that they see. That's going to be their elasticity and, in essence, the amount of blood being pushed in. Okay, so the more blood you have coming in, the higher the pressure is going to be, and this is the dangerous bit. Depending upon how flexible, how elastic the arteries are. Okay, if they are toughening up, the pressure goes up. Okay, when you have your blood vessels aren't as elastic as they should be, the pressure goes up dramatically. That can get real dangerous. So let's talk a little bit about what's called pulse pressure. Okay, so at this stage, systolic pressure versus diastolic pressure. Systolic pressure is the pressure as a result of ventricular contraction, and then when the ventricles relax, the pressure starts to drop. And the lowest it gets before the next contraction wave, that's the diastolic pressure. So the systolic pressure is the highest pressure you get. The diastolic pressure is as low as the pressure gets before the next contraction wave. Now, what we're trying to learn here is, you can end up with major issues as a result of these pressures being too high. Okay, when your blood pressure is too high, you end up causing issues with the elasticity of your arterial network. Over time, the arteries just wear out. They lose their elasticity, and you end up with issues. All right, so let's discuss. So the first thing I want to talk about is pulse pressure. Okay, pulse pressure is the systolic pressure minus the diastolic pressure. So in other words, what's the whole range? If your blood pressure is 120/75, you got 120 up here and 75 down here, your pulse pressure, which is the difference between the two, would be 45 milligrams of mercury. Again, it's the measurement of pressure. And the reason we want to work out pulse pressure is because what we want to get is mean arterial pressure. Now, a mean is the number you would expect, the expected number. That is the amount of pressure in an artery at any given moment. How much do you expect to be there? And it ain't that, and it ain't that, and it ain't that. What you have to do is you do a little bit of a formula here. You take your mean arterial pressure being equal to diastolic pressure plus pulse pressure divided by 3. Now, I'm not going to get into the reasons for this, but the idea is that your mean value is going to be a little lower because systolic pressure lasts less time than does diastolic pressure. Yeah, your systolic pressure lasts less time than does diastolic pressure, so your mean value is a little below average, okay, a little bit below average. Now, I would never ask you to compute this on a test. The reason I'm telling you about this is if your mean pressure in your arterial network is too high, you will wear out the elasticity of your arteries. You end up with atherosclerosis, you end up having heart attacks and strokes and aneurysms and what have you. This is scary, scary stuff. It's the silent killer. And we're going to talk about it here in a little while. People's blood pressure starts creeping up and creeping up and creeping up and creeping up, and you just don't notice. But what you don't realize is that the pressure is growing in terms of your arterial network, and that high pressure situation starts to wear out your arteries. So if you want to live to see your grandkids, you got to keep a monitor on your blood pressure. All right, yeah. So MAP, or mean arterial pressure, this line here. Okay, there it is, right there. It's a little below what you'd expect as average between systolic and diastolic. The mean arterial pressure is the most influential number here in terms of your risk for disorders like atherosclerosis, kidney failure, aneurysms, what have you. Now, what the heck, kidney failure? You got to imagine that inside your kidneys, these big bloody pulses through what are called your glomeruli and your nephrons. We'll be talking about that later. They can wear out just like everything else. Okay, so this is certainly something to consider. Keep an eye on your blood pressure. Go sit in the machine at Publix and let it kick out a number to you. If it's consistently high, and we'll talk about what the numbers should be in a little while, consider getting that checked on. All right, on to blood pressure. So at this stage in our lives, we know a little bit about blood pressure and sort of how it's measured. I predict. We will go through and talk more about this in terms of lab, but the process is very simple. You use a tool called a sphygmomanometer. It's a fancy word, sphygmomanometer. And what this is going to do is it's going to wrap around your arm, and you pump this thing up, and you pump and you pump and you pump and you pump, and it builds pressure. And you're listening with a stethoscope. And as you pump it up and you're listening with the stethoscope, pump, 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 eventually you will put so much pressure in that cuff that it will block blood flow off to the arm. Okay? Once you reach that critical point of preventing any flow to the arm, you have found the amount of pressure necessary to stop the heart's pumping of pressure into the arm. Okay, you can stop it. You get to that point. That's normally somewhere around 120 milligrams of mercury, or millimeters of mercury, I should say. Somewhere around 120 millimeters of mercury. And you can feel it. You're like, wow, this feels wrong. No, there's no blood going to my arm. This is a problem. And then you start letting off the pressure. And as you let off the pressure and you're listening, you can hear the blood rushing past the cuff and rushing past the cuff and rushing past the cuff. And eventually it will get to a point where you no longer hear the blood pressing past the cuff. And that number is 70. That would be your diastolic number, when you're no longer able to hear the sound coming through the stethoscope. All right, so that's how we measure blood pressure. We'll be talking more about that come time for lab. But pressure itself, blood pressure, is determined by three basic concepts. That is your cardiac output, the amount of blood your heart pumps in a minute, your blood volume, the physical amount of blood that you have. All right. There are people that get injuries and they lose a lot of blood and their blood pressure drops as a result of this. Just not enough blood in the system. And then, of course, resistance. So the more resistance you have, the higher your pressure goes. And this is pretty obvious from my perspective. Think about atherosclerosis. Plaque buildup in your arterial network. When you have a lot of plaque buildup, your blood pressure goes up because there's more resistance. Resistance from the friction of blood as it goes through the blood vessels. And resistance is sort of determined by three things. The viscosity of the blood. You guys probably remember the hematocrit, the amount of red blood cells that are there. You can have low red blood cell count and the blood gets very watery because there's more plasma. Or alternatively, you can have a higher red blood cell count, and the more red blood cells you have, that means the less plasma, and the blood gets kind of sludgy, more viscous. So the thicker the blood is, the more resistance there is. So as the blood's pumping, if it's thick, it's harder to get through the system. That's why blood doping, you can have folks die when they're doing athletic activities, because if they have too many red blood cells, the blood's too thick and the heart's pumping, and as the heart does, cardiac output, the pressure's going to go up. And as the pressure goes up, you can end up with strokes and aneurysms and what have you, dangerous stuff. All right, the blood vessel length, longer vessels have more resistance, as you would expect. Think about a hose, right? If you've got a spigot on your house for water to come out of, and you turn it on, water's just jetting out of that thing. But if you put a hose on it and it's full length, you turn on the water and you look at the water coming out of the hose, it is not as impressive because the length of it decreases the force at the end of the day. The resistance of having to flow through that hose slows the water down. And then blood vessel radius. This is vasoconstriction and vasodilation. If you dilate a blood vessel, less resistance. If you constrict a blood vessel, more resistance. So these are very important. So these factors determine resistance, and all of these factors determine pressure. Okay, how much blood the heart's pumping, the amount of blood in the system, and how much resistance there is dependent upon viscosity, the length of the vessels, and the diameter therein. Okay, so all of this determines the pressure of blood as it flows through the system. Did I skip something? Yeah, parting comments on blood pressure. All right, from the aorta to the capillaries, the velocity decreases by a huge margin. So blood coming through the aorta, this is coming right out of the spigot, right, is going to be traveling at a very high rate and have the highest pressure generated by the body. The aorta sees all the pressure, which is why it's elastic, so it can balloon out and take the pressure and then come back to its resting state. Yeah, friction, let's see, we talked about going into the arterioles, which have really high resistance. The arterioles are really important because they are really the killer of blood flow and resistance for that matter. So the arterioles are being so small that they really eat up blood pressure in essence. They have really high resistance, so the blood that flows through the capillaries has to be at a pretty low pressure, about 15 millimeters of mercury. Yes, let's see, okay, capillary beds, blood pressure drops to 35 millimeters of mercury at the start of the capillaries. By the time it leaves, it's about 15. The idea is you got to have the blood pressure low in the capillaries. You can't have 120 millimeters of mercury flowing through your capillary beds. That would be devastatingly bad. One, you would be venting all of your blood plasma every time the heart beats. And two, you could probably blow out the walls of different capillaries. I mean, they're just not meant to handle it. Yeah, high blood pressure would rupture the thin wall capillaries, absolutely. So you got to keep that low, and the arterioles play a major role in that. The arterioles just eat up blood pressure with all the resistance from being small in diameter. Yeah, that's good. All right, from the capillaries to your vena cava, so superior and inferior vena cava, the flow begins to go up again. Man, this is kind of a weird concept, but I'll try my absolute best to lay it out for you. So imagine the arteries are pumping all this blood, and all that blood is spreading out through all these crazy capillary beds all over the body. Okay, really spreading out. It's going to reach a really low pressure point when it makes its way into all those arterioles, or I'm sorry, venules. When the blood leaves the capillary beds, all these capillary beds, all the body gets into these venules, and then from the venules into veins, and from the little veins to larger veins, and eventually it's going to begin to converge back into the superior and inferior vena cava. The idea of having all of this blood in the capillaries and funneling that down into the superior and inferior vena cava, the pressure goes up a little bit. Okay, nowhere near what it has in an artery. Okay, not even in a hunt, but the pressure does rise a little bit. Okay, do I have anything else on here worthwhile? Large amount of blood being forced into smaller channels. That's what's happening from venules to veins, yeah. But it never regains the velocity of the larger arteries. But you do get a little bit more pressure back. All right, mechanisms of venous return. Man, this is freaking important. You guys got to be friends with this, all right? I want you to know all about it. Venous return is really important. So when blood leaves the capillaries and it goes into the venules, from the venules to the veins, getting blood back to the heart is complicated. Okay, you got gravity working against you. It's a really low pressure system. It's not just the heart pumping and pumping blood through capillaries doesn't force blood back to the heart through the venules and veins. That is not the way this works. The blood will love to pool up. Venous pooling, not a good idea. So there must be ways, okay? There must be ways of getting blood back to the heart, especially from your lower half of the body where you're fighting gravity to get that blood back to the heart, man. There's got to be ways of doing it, and there's 5, okay? 1, pressure gradient. Every time your heart beats, there's pressure being put into the arteries. That pressure in the arteries leads to the arterioles, leads to capillaries, leads to the venules, leads to the veins. The heart pumping certainly helps, okay? But it is not sufficient to do the job, especially not if you're standing up. It is not sufficient to do the job. There must be other ways of assisting the system. And the first is gravity, okay? My upper extremities, man, they're easy to drain. All right, let's have an example. Can you see my hands and the way they look? Okay, me and my Northern Scottish heritage, my hands are almost pink. I can take one hand and put it up above my head, okay, and let gravity do its work, and I'll let gravity drain blood out of that hand. And when I come back to you and I show you this one and that one, they look distinctly different, okay? Very light in color, very normal in color from my perspective. That's because gravity drains the blood out of your upper torso, okay? It's going to drain it out of the superior vena cava, not a big deal. Gravity really helps. The lower extremities, it hurts, but it helps the upper extremities. Skeletal muscle pump. I invite you to pause this video and go watch videos of guys flying in jet planes, man, in like fighter planes and stuff. They have to clench their muscles up to keep blood in their brain, or else they red out or black out, okay, depending upon which way you're going. But they have to use skeletal muscles to flex and limit where blood goes in the body. So you can really tense up your lower body and keep blood in your head, as an example, okay? So every time you do what you do, when you flex your muscles, you are in essence squeezing the blood vessels all around your body, okay? When I flex my calf muscles, when I'm doing what I do, walking around on a daily basis, that muscle flexion squeezes my veins. And when the muscle flexion squeezes my veins, it pushes blood up. And does the blood come back down? No, because what do we have? Valves, okay? Every time you squeeze the muscles there, you are certainly going to squeeze blood up towards the heart, and then the valves prevent backflow. Very, very important for us. And again, varicose veins is when the valves are blown out and they don't work as well as they should. Skeletal muscle pump, good, good, good. All right, thoracic or respiratory pump. Now, when I decide to breathe, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flex my diaphragm. It's going to go pull air in. Then I'm going to relax my diaphragm. Let that air back out. Flex it, pulls air in, relax it, let that air back out. What I'm doing is I'm creating a low pressure environment in the thoracic cavity. That also affects blood flow. When you take a deep breath, you're pulling blood in from your extremities into your thoracic cavity back towards the heart. And when you relax, can the blood just leave now? No, because there's valves that prevent backflow. Okay, it's a really neat system. And then, of course, cardiac suction. You know, when these man, have mercy. When the heart relaxes, when the atria squeeze blood down into the ventricles, and then they relax, that act of relaxing sucks blood into them. Okay, so you got to think about these. Man, why am I doing this? My brain's not working. When you think about the atria, there we go. When the atria contract, they send blood down. When they relax again, the valves prevent backflow in the heart. That act of relaxing sucks blood into the heart from the veins coming back to, either from the lungs or from the systemic circuit. So that's cardiac suction. Every time the heart relaxes, it's going to suck a little bit of blood in through the vena cava. And all of these three, skeletal muscle pump, thoracic, respiratory, and cardiac suction, they all depend upon exercise. So when you're exercising, these are going to go up dramatically, so that's going to increase the flow through the system. Works like a charm. All right, neural control of blood pressure. Now, the real game to be played here is talking about your autonomic nervous system and its control centers. So you have this vasomotor center, part of the medulla oblongata, and it sort of runs the show in terms of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. But really, the overarching commander of all this is your hypothalamus. Okay, your hypothalamus is your autonomic control center, and by doing so, it controls your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, very simplistically, your sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system controls tonicity of your blood vessels. Now, what the heck does that mean? When you have a lot of sympathetic influence to your blood vessels, the blood vessels constrict. When you have very little sympathetic influence to your blood vessels, the vessels dilate. Okay, so how does just the sympathetic nervous system determine blood flow? A lot of input, constrict the vessels, less input, dilate the vessels. That's just the way it goes. So increased sympathetic activity gives vasoconstriction, which increases pressure. Sorry, that was throwing me for a second. And then by comparison, lower sympathetic activity leads to dilation and decreasing blood pressure. And you've got to think of pressure and flow as being sort of opposite sides of the same coin. All right, now, how the heck do we do this? Well, we got to constantly monitor your blood pressure. Your body is constantly keeping an eye on it, making sure it's not up too high or down too low, and varying the amount of pressure that's generated based off of your activity levels. So if you're running around doing all sorts of things, your pressure is going to raise up a little bit. And if you're laying down relaxing, your pressure is going to drop. So this is done in three basic ways. We have baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are primarily found in like your aorta, and basically they sense stretch. Okay, the amount of stretch is going to be picked up by baroreceptors. You're going to be seeing these again, so you're going to be friends with them. You have chemoreceptors that basically determine the blood's pH. What they're looking for is if the blood becomes too acidic, that's a sign that you have too much carbon dioxide in the blood, so you better start moving around a little faster. So your heart rate's going to go up, your pressure's going to go up, so that you can get blood to the lungs and get rid of that acidic environment. bring blood back towards its basic nature, about 7.4. All right, so you're going to offload carbon dioxide, because when you have a lot of carbon dioxide in your blood, that's carbonic acid builds up and you end up with a problem. But anyway, so to get more oxygen, that's what's happening here with these chemoreceptors. They're basically sensing pH. And then last but not least, you have higher brain centers like your hypothalamus, your cerebral cortex, and they are going to be working with all of these other body structures, determining, your blood's osmolarity, your body's temperature, all sorts of things that are going to govern the amount of pressure necessary to keep your system working. Okay, with that in mind, I want to go right here. Let's lay with this baroreceptor reflex. Feel free to give this a read. I'm just going to explain to you what happens. All right, so if your blood pressure begins to drop, and it drops too much, what will happen is your body will pick up this shift in pressure as a result of these baroreceptors. This sends a message to your brain and generates a reflex arc, if you will. Okay, and what will happen is very simplistic. If your pressure is too low, you increase heart rate and you vasoconstrict your blood vessels. Okay, so if the pressure is too low, you constrict your blood vessels and you increase your heart rate, and that brings the pressure back up. So you get the pressure where you want it by constricting the vessels and increasing the heart rate. To decrease blood pressure is the exact opposite. Okay, if your pressure is too high, you got to dilate your vessels and slow your heart down, and that brings the pressure back down to where it's supposed to be. And again, how do we know? How do we know if this is the way it's working? We use baroreceptors. These baroreceptors pick up the stretch in the aorta where the pressure is the highest in the aorta, and then allow us to use the sympathetic nervous system to vary vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems to vary the speed at which the heart is pumping. Normally, the parasympathetic division kind of holds heart rate at its resting about 70, and the parasympathetic nervous system has the ability to sort of take that away and speed the heart up if necessary. All right, and that's how that goes. Great, that's baroreceptors. Hormonal control. Man, this stuff can be all over the map. So let's just run through them. So epinephrine, norepinephrine. You can take a hit of epinephrine, inject that into your system, and your heart rate's going to go through the roof. That's adrenaline. Okay, you get that adrenaline rush, classic increase in heart rate. The famous example from my perspective is you're laying in bed, relaxing, having a good rest, and you look at your watch or you see the alarm clock, and you're supposed to have been somewhere 5 minutes ago. Well, you jump up and you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta go. But then you realize it's Saturday and you didn't have to be anywhere. So you can just lay back down and go to sleep, right? Wrong. Because what's your heart rate doing? It's pounding, right? Your heart is absolutely pounding. That's adrenaline released from your adrenal glands above your kidneys. And it's playing all kinds of hell with your system, okay? Very important. Adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, these are going to play a role in increasing your heart rate, most certainly. Increasing blood pressure. Let's see, angiotensin, antidiuretic hormone. Yeah, man. Let's talk about it. So antidiuretic hormone is worthy of our consideration. What this does is it makes your collecting ducts very permeable to water. This is in your kidneys. The long story short of that is that your kidneys take up and store more water. Okay, antidiuretic. A diuretic is something that makes you go to the bathroom, makes you urinate. So if it's antidiuretic, it's going to make you not go to the bathroom. You're going to hold more water. And if your body's retaining water, what does that do to your blood volume? Your blood volume goes up. And if your blood volume goes up, more pressure. Okay, pressure rises. That's certainly what's happening here. What else do we have? Epinephrine, we've already done. Atrial natriuretic hormone is what this is oftentimes called. They're saying peptide. But normally it's ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone. Atrial natriuretic hormone is let out by the atria of your myocardium, all right, in response to high pressures. And basically what it does is it increases salt offload. Okay, so you excrete more salt, and what you got to imagine here is water follows the solute. So if your kidneys are dropping salt like crazy, then water will be following that salt, and that's going to decrease your blood volume, and that's going to bring your pressure down. So atrial natriuretic hormone, you're bringing your pressure down, and the way that you do this is by releasing a lot of urine. Let me make sure we're clear on this. So what this hormone does is it causes you to excrete a bunch of salt into what will become urine. And when you excrete a bunch of salt into what will become urine, it changes the osmotic balance in the kidneys. It increases the amount of urine that you physically produce. So by excreting a bunch of salt, that means you're excreting a bunch of water, or it's staying behind osmotically, you might say. And that means that your urine output just goes up really high. So when your urine output goes up, that decreases your blood volume, brings your pressure down. And then down here at the very bottom, you got aldosterone. Where's aldosterone? Do I not have it on? Yeah, here we go. Aldosterone. So aldosterone is a salt-retaining hormone. And again, if you keep the salt in the kidneys, you're going to keep the water in the kidneys. If you keep the water in the kidneys, your blood volume is going to go up, and you're going to increase your blood pressure. Man, I feel like this is all over the place, but I think I made a point. We're going to do this all over when we do the kidneys and the urinary system. But the idea that you want to think about is that water follows the salt. Wherever the salt goes, water follows it. So if the salt is going into the urine, that means water is going to follow that, and your blood volume is going to go down, and so is your pressure. Whereas if you're storing the salt internally, that means you're going to be also storing water. Your blood volume is going to rise as you drink, and you're going to, as a side effect of that, be storing water, increasing your blood pressure. There's one more fun thing to talk about here. What was it? Antidiuretic hormone? Yeah. This is sort of unrelated, but it's fun and worth our time, I suppose. So antidiuretic hormone, what this does is it makes you have a lower urine output to keep fluid internally. This is one of the ways that we balance ourselves osmotically. So to keep our blood volume where it's supposed to be, we secrete antidiuretic hormone to limit the amount of urine that we produce, unless you're drinking alcohol. Alcohol inhibits the action of antidiuretic hormone. So if you know someone perhaps that drinks on occasion, and when they drink they have to go to the bathroom all the time, the reason they have to go to the bathroom is because antidiuretic hormone is not working the way it's supposed to work. So your blood volume is dropping, and along with that can be your blood pressure. Okay, perfect. Let's talk about autoregulation. The idea is very simple. If your tissues are low in oxygen, or if your tissues are getting a buildup of waste, they will release chemicals that cause local vasodilation, which increases the amount of blood flow to the area, which should get them appropriate levels of oxygen and the availability to offload wastes. Once that's done, the secretion of those chemicals stops, and they are able to vasoconstrict the vessels near themselves and lead to decreased blood flow until you have a buildup of carbon dioxide and a buildup of waste again. Then you bring in blood flow again. The concept is, boy, I wish you guys could see how nasty it's getting outside. It's pretty rough, pretty rough. Where am I going with this? That's autoregulation. So the tissues regulate themselves locally. It's a local thing. They use local hormones to accomplish this task. There are certain vasoactive chemicals that are worthy of our consideration. That's a fact. So let's talk about it. During trauma, things like inflammation, for example, can certainly augment your levels of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Histamine, bradykinin, prostaglandins. Imagine that you want to keep a lot of blood flow to an area where there's been damage. You get a cut, you want to seal that hole as quickly as possible. But once it's sealed, you want to bring in plenty of blood flow in order to heal the area and clean up damage and destroy any bacteria or pathogens that might have gotten in any way, shape, or form. Okay, that's where these come in. That's what histamine does. That's what these are for, is to increase blood flow to areas to increase the healing process. And I get this question every year. Somebody's like, oh, I got a scab. You know, I cut myself by accident. I accidentally cut myself, and it scabbed over, and I didn't think any of the amount, it didn't really bleed, wasn't a big deal. But then I scratched it, and it just bleeds everywhere. That's because of these chemicals increasing the amount of blood flow, and also, well, I wanted to go right over here. We had sort of talked about some of these others as well that keep your blood vessels either dilated or constricted. Things like prostacyclin and nitric oxide in blood vessels will sort of keep your platelets from balling up in situations where you don't have damage to your vessels. So your blood vessels release these local hormones to keep the vessel dilated as well. All right, what I want to talk about a little bit is angiogenesis. So this is the growth of new blood vessels, typically as a result of hypoxic environments. Here we have a man whom you would call a Sherpa, okay? Boy, it is storming outside. You would not believe it. All right, moving on. He's a Sherpa. So you watch these videos from Everest or big mountains in Nepal, okay? And there's Westerners, and they've got all this gear on and all this crazy stuff, oxygen masks, and they're trudging up this mountain, and they're barely surviving. People die on Everest every year. But then you look beside them, and the locals that help them get up the mountain, they're like this. They are not dressed to the nines because they can handle it. How the heck do they handle it? Because of angiogenesis. They grow new blood vessels into areas where they have low oxygen content that have gone hypoxic for one reason or another, and they increase their red blood cell count because they're in a low oxygen environment, so they have better oxygen carrying capacity. It works like a charm. Let's see, what else do we want to say here? Coronary artery obstructions, exercise, and muscles. Yeah, I think that'll do. So we can certainly grow in new arteries, new veins, new capillary beds to areas that are in low oxic supply, all right? And that's an interesting nuance to how your cardiovascular system works. All right, shock. Oh man, terrifying. Let me tell you something, folks. I'm reading about this in the middle of the night, and it's just, man, it's scary stuff. So worthy of our consideration. You need to know about it so you can recognize the problems if you ever run into it. All right. Shock is any state in which the cardiac output is insufficient to meet the body's needs. Okay, 2 categories: cardiac shock and low venous return based. Cardiac shock is simply when the heart can't pump blood adequately. You had a heart attack and the heart's damaged, heart can't pump blood the way it's supposed to. That is cardiogenic shock. Low venous return falls into 2 realms, what's called hypovolemic shock and vascular shock. Hypovolemic, low volume. Okay, you get low blood volume as a result of a bleed out, like a what do you call it? A hemorrhage of some form, major trauma, a burn is the classic example, even dehydration. So imagine you get some sort of disease that makes your stomach upset all the time. You can end up with hypovolemic shock because you're going to the bathroom so much that you're becoming dehydrated, or even throwing up. So if you throw up too much, you can get dehydrated. You guys are aware of this, all right? But what I want to talk about are burns. So if you burn yourself over a large amount of the body, well, hang on, let me go back even further. You've burned yourself at some stage and gotten a blister, okay? What that blister is where the body is no longer able to hold fluid in, so the fluid accrues underneath the dead skin from the burn, okay? If you burn yourself over a large portion of the body, you're going to be venting fluid off at a really high rate. You'll have to go into hypovolemic shock. That's why if somebody goes into the emergency room with a major burn across a decent amount of the body, what they're concerned with is getting needles in you to pipe you full of saline because you're losing fluid so fast. You'll go into shock and you'll have an aneurysm, have a heart attack or a stroke or what have you. It happens, man. It happens all the time. And then, of course, there is vascular shock. So vascular shock can be due to a whole host of things, but I want to talk about anaphylaxis. Yeah, let's talk about anaphylaxis. So let's say you are allergic to something. Nuts, bee stings, what have you, something. You have an allergy. And if you get that bee sting and that toxin gets into your bloodstream and starts flowing all around your body's going to have a system-wide reaction to it. That's going into anaphylactic shock. Okay, you're going to release histamine everywhere. That's going to cause broad-spectrum vasodilation of your blood vessels. You're going to have a bunch of fluid leaving the vessels and accruing in your tissues. You're going to end up with problems as a result. Check out this kid's face, man. Poor kid. This is heartbreaking to me. Did I skip something here? I had more images in this. I don't know what the heck I did with them. So you can see how swollen kids' eyes are. This is classic buildup of histamine, typically as a result of a bee sting or something along those lines. Or even, I had a friend that was allergic to fresh cut grass as a high school, or when we were in elementary school. We'd go outside and play, man, and he would just swell on up. I didn't realize how dangerous it was at the time. You got to imagine all that fluid building up in this poor kid, like in his extremities, edema, if you will, build up fluid. It's supposed to be in the bloodstream, and if it's not in the bloodstream, that blood's getting thicker. If the blood's getting thicker, you can run into aneurysms and strokes and what have you. Very dangerous stuff, man. Very dangerous. So what we will do is, in a situation like this where we get this broad spectrum vasodilation, we'll hit them with an EpiPen. And the EpiPen, the adrenaline, causes hardcore vasoconstriction. So we constrict those vessels back down and keep them. All right, folks, we are now in my office. It's been a whole host of problems and phone calls and batteries dying and all that fun stuff. I'm trying to get us through this lecture as best I can. So we're going to have to do it here because my batteries died and I'm not walking down the hall a million times. All right, I believe we were talking about vascular shock, particularly anaphylaxis. Again, when we release histamine in a broad spectrum, it can lead to all kinds of problems. The body swells, you get this edema, this swelling, if you will. So we administer an EpiPen, and what the EpiPen does is lead to broad spectrum vasoconstriction. So by constricting the vessels, we limit the loss as a result of the anaphylaxis, the histamine release, and then the lymphatic system can start picking up the excess fluid and returning it to the cardiovascular network. All right, so that's why we administer EpiPens, is because it leads to vasoconstriction. Now, I want you to be able to recognize the symptoms of anaphylaxis. I think that's a worthy thing for you to know. So generally speaking, coughing, wheezing, these are classic conditions of when you're weeping out a lot of fluid from your mucous membranes and it's building up internally. Kids itch, they have tightness in the chest, they develop hives and rashes. Man, I wish I had the pictures here. Hang on. All right, look at this poor kiddo, man. Oh my gosh. So you can see the webs that are forming here. This is that classic rash, or classic, where am I at? Hives, if you will, is the key term here. Classic hives. And the concept is, and boy, it scares me to death. I'm not even going to play games with you. This sort of thing is terrifying. While this is happening, kid seems fine. Kid seems totally fine. Happy-go-lucky, she's playing her game, all's well in the world. And then it goes sour quickly. All right? So if you start seeing this, if you start seeing that swelling like this here, man, you better take some steps. All right, you better take some steps, because what will happen is the swelling, red eyes, wheezing, you're closing up the capacity to breathe, and then eventually your blood pressure is going to crash. And when that happens, you're in bad shape. All right, so keep an eye. All right, keep an eye. That's what I'm going to say. Let's see, what else do I want to say here? I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's a good place to be. Let's jump into atherosclerosis. I think I'll go ahead and make this full size to make sure that we can see it. Good. All right, so atherosclerosis, classic issue with your blood vessels. When we have a buildup of plaque here, this is a sterol that can build up in the wall of the artery. What will happen is that limits the amount of flow that can pass through and increases the resistance. And that increases your blood's pressure, okay? So this can certainly lead to heart attacks and strokes and what have you. Now, if the plaque is just hanging out in there, we call it a thrombus. And if it breaks loose and starts to flow, that's an embolus. And that can lead to a whole host of other issues as well. Imagine that getting into the lungs or getting into the brain and clogging up some blood vessels there. It's bad news, bad news. Very highly associated with strokes, heart attacks, and aneurysms. There are ways of preventing this. The main goal is, from my perspective, make sure you get omega-3s in your diet, potentially limiting your saturated fats and cholesterol, but the main one from my perspective is watching your sugar intake. High sugar diets are really driving this these days, and it's something we can all manage. Okay, decreasing your sugar intake is very important. General hypertension is a side effect of atherosclerosis, is a side effect of building up plaque. Anything over 140/90 is going to be considered high blood pressure, and it is indeed considered a silent killer. You just don't notice it, man. You just don't notice it until you end up with a heart attack or a stroke or a kidney failure or what have you. You got to manage this. It's very easy to manage. We have medications that knock it right on out. You just got to keep an eye on it and actually, get taken care of. An aneurysm is when a blood vessel can balloon. Okay, when it balloons out, it's decreasing flow and can lead to a host of problems. So these can rupture. And when they rupture, it's fatal. All right. You've heard the stories. So I've got a cousin. He was a police officer. And he had to get routine physicals, like every few weeks or months, routine physicals. And he was always top of the line, super healthy. And one day they found him dead in a parking lot. Just laying there, dead in a parking lot. His keys were in the door to unlock his patrol car. All right? The keys were in the door. He just fell down dead. He had an aneurysm, and it ruptured. Terrifying, man. Absolutely terrifying. You can increase your risk of this as a result of atherosclerosis, building up pressure as a result, leading to the elasticity of these vessels wearing out and then ballooning under high stress loads. Yeah, scary stuff. Strokes. So a stroke is any condition where you have a low oxygen environment in the brain. This can be a result of a hemorrhage to the brain. So you have an area of the brain that's not getting blood because it's bleeding elsewhere. But more common is the ischemic stroke. So what happens here is you get a blockage. So an area of the brain is going to be in a low oxygen environment. Now this is pretty easy to diagnose. You look at somebody's, this is called the FAST concept. So you look at somebody's face. Is part of it paralyzed? One side is, the other side looks fine. Stroke victim. Look at their arms, all right? If they can raise both arms up and one of them's kind of sagging, classic stroke victim. This tends to strike one side of the body as opposed to the other. Speech. If you're talking to them and they're lacking understanding, or if they're trying to talk to you and it makes no sense, classic stroke situation. And the idea is you want to get these people to the hospital immediately. If it's this situation where there's just a blockage, we can administer vasodilators and administer anticoagulants, and we can bust up the blockage, and the person will be more or less all right. But if they sit around and they want to wait a few hours, that's going to give the anoxic area, the neurons that are going to die, and there's no coming back from that. It's going to be very, very dangerous indeed. So the main point I want to make is you want to get to the doctor as soon as possible. And then last but not least, treating these things. And we've already sort of talked about this a little bit when we did the heart. But I will point out that we certainly have drugs that can break up clotting. And then in situations where we have blockages, we have the ability to do bypass surgeries where we can take an artery or a vein from somewhere else and pipe it into the aorta and go around blockages. That's bypass surgery. Or alternatively, we can do stents. And again, a stent and angioplasty, what we do is we go in through the leg, up to the heart, and then into the artery and blow up a balloon. And when we blow that balloon up, there's a stent or a piece of wire mesh that will then hold the vessel open, allowing for adequate blood flow. So these are ways that we can deal with blockages when we have to. And that's all I got to say about that. So this has been a pretty wild lecture from my perspective. There's been a lot of interruptions and a lot of phone calls and a lot of thunder. But I hope that I've gotten all the points to you. So yeah, man, I think that's got it. So folks, welcome to my office at this stage. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you later on. Thanks.